if you haven't watched part one of this two-part series on trolling motors, go back and watch part one, please, before you watch part two. Because again, I wanted to talk about trolling motors. People ask me a lot of questions about how I do what I do, why I use the trolling motor that I use, and how can they overcome some of the issues that they have trying to use a trolling motor. So, like I mentioned in part one is more about the usage of that motor and how I use it. Part two is going to be a little bit more technical about the things that I do to a trolling motor to make them work for me. So, first things first. As you can see, I buy the cheapy Endura 30 pound thrust trolling motors from Minn Kota. I like those motors because they're reliable and they're also inexpensive. So for me, the way that I use them and beat them up, I can usually get 2 to 3 years out of one of these motors, which many of the saltwater motors, and again, you may have a different experience, so hopefully you'll watch part one of this, so you know what I'm talking about here, but don't get upset if you disagree with what I'm saying here. You could let me know, but let's please try to be courteous, okay? Because in my experience, the saltwater motors, they barely last longer than the freshwater motors if you take a couple of preventative measures when you first get the freshwater motors. So, to be honest, you know, I can get 2 to 3 years out of one of these motors, and a lot of times you can find them for as cheap as 80 bucks on sale. But most of the time they're right around 100. And, you know, a comparable saltwater motor in the lowest thrust is easily 250, if not more. So I can buy almost 3 of these motors, depending on the price, for the cost of one saltwater motor. So to me, it's a good deal, and especially how I use them and how I beat them up. So, okay, that's part of it. Now, the first thing that I do when I get one of these saltwater motors is, let me see if I can, I might put a picture in here so you guys can see, but right here in the bottom of the head unit, there are 6 screws. And there's also a bolt right here that attaches the head unit to the shaft. Those are not stainless steel in the freshwater versions. So the very first thing I do is I take out those 6 screws and that bolt, and I replace them. Okay, now, as you can see on this trolling motor has a 47-inch shaft. I have figured out the length that works really well for me on this boat, but I don't buy them that way. I buy them with a 30-inch shaft. And I actually extend the shaft myself. So you can see there's an extra coupler in there. I actually join 2 shafts together with a ferrule like you would have in like a fishing rod. And I extend the wiring and make the shaft the length that I want. So it's not hard to do, but that's a tip for you if you can't find the length of trolling motor shaft that you want. It is possible to extend them. You can usually find someone selling a cheap broken trolling motor online, and you can buy it for pennies and just take the shaft off of it and cut it and, you know, adjust it to fit your needs. So that's what I do there. Next, let's talk about props on a trolling motor. One of the big issues you're going to have with almost any trolling motor right out of the box, especially out here in the lagoon, now that the grass is coming back. That wasn't such a big issue when there was no grass, but now that there's a lot of grass coming back, you're going to find that the stock props that come with these trolling motors, and most trolling motors, are going to just catch an insane amount of grass, and it's going to drive you nuts all day. So one of the first things I do, first off, this is what, on this particular trolling motor, this is what the stock prop looks like. So the first thing that I do, before I even use it, is that I go out and I get a weedless prop. So this is the weedless prop for this particular motor. And you can see the difference. They're completely different shaped. There's a lot bigger blades on these weedless props. but they're also a different shape, so they actually shed the grass really, really well. And one of the tricks that you'll need if you get one of these is after a while you're going to hit oysters and shells and rocks and things and sticks, and you're going to get a bunch of little nicks on the leading edge of this prop. So when you get those little nicks, it'll start catching grass on those nicks. So what you need to do periodically is take a file and file this edge smooth. So this is an old one. I don't use this one anymore. I've kind of, used the lifespan of this, so it's done. But I keep them around just as a spare, just in case I need to throw one on. So the other thing that I do to these props, regardless of what kind of prop it is I don't know if you can see these little holes that are drilled in the front of the prop. So I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but sometimes if you tilt the trolling motor up and stow it, right after you stow it and you start running, you'll start getting spray coming back and hitting you. And you might not know where that's coming from. You might think it's just being kicked up from the bow, but what's happening is these little indentations inside of your prop are holding water. And as you're running, the prop is bouncing and this water is leaking out through the gap right at the back of the prop, and then it's coming, the wind is throwing it back at you. So what I do is I drill one little tiny hole in each one of those little indentations in the back of your prop. And so when you tilt it up, all the water drains out, and then you don't have that problem with that spray coming back and getting on your glasses or just getting you wet when you don't want to be wet. So it's not a lot of water, but it's a real simple fix and it works great, believe me. So there you go. That's what I do as far as props, and that'll help you stay weedless a lot if you can find a weedless prop for your particular motor. Okay, now another thing I do to my trolling motors is I actually create these plastic shims. So it's just a plastic tube. I cut a split in it so I can actually snap it around the shaft of the trolling motor. And you can see I actually have one in right here. It's a shorter one than this one. This is a taller one. I have another one in the front hatch. And what I use these for is different water depths and different loads on the boat. So if I have two people on the boat, let's say, and someone's in the back, the bow is going to rise a little bit higher than it will when I'm by myself. So I'll put in the shortest one that I have. But not always. Again, it depends on conditions. Also, if the water depth is super shallow and say there's a lot of grass and I really need to run the trolling motor as shallow as possible, I'll put in this longest one. And the prop will still stay below the surface, but I just have to be super careful with the longer one to make sure it doesn't cavitate. So I use this to make these little adjustments, because if I try to use the collars, a lot of times they don't stick and they'll slide. So I like to use these little shims, and they work really well, and they're easier to put on than those collars too. If you've ever tried to replace one of those collars, you can do it, but they're a pain in the ass. So I like making these little shims, and they work really well for that. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is placement of your trolling motor. Okay, so again, this is my preference. If you want to do something different, that's great. I respect your opinion. You do what works for you. I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm responding to questions about what I do. Okay, so if you disagree with me, that's fantastic. Let's not argue about it. You're welcome to tell me your opinion, but let's do it in a non-confrontational way, because you can do whatever you think. This is what I think. So as far as your trolling motor placement, I prefer the trolling motor on the left-hand side. And the reason for that is I am primarily a right-handed caster. So I hold the rod all day long in the right hand, and I control the trolling motor with the left because of that. So given that, I almost never have to switch hands with the rod. I usually have the line ready to go, And so I can be sitting here driving the trolling motor, see a fish, and make a cast without ever letting go of the trolling motor. So it's very efficient and it works very, very well for me. Now if I had the trolling motor on the right hand side, I would have to do either a couple of things. I would have to reach across every time I want to control the trolling motor, or I would have to take the rod and switch it to the other hand and then drive the trolling motor with my dominant hand. But if I needed to cast, then I would have to let go of the trolling motor, switch back, and make that cast. So, in my opinion, it's far easier to put the trolling motor on your non-dominant side so that you can cast if you need to, and you're not switching hands all day long. Because if you think about it, in the course of a day of fishing, you're certainly making hundreds of casts, if not thousands on some days. So that is a lot of unnecessary fooling around with the rod, switching it back and forth between hands, and seconds count. When you see a redfish, you don't have time to be sitting here, oh wait, there's a redfish, let me turn the trolling motor off, switch my rod around to my dominant hand, let's make that cast. You know, I mean, that's all time that the redfish has to spook. So the faster you can make that transition from seeing the fish to getting a lure in front of its face, the better off you will be. So again, in my opinion, you're much better off with the trolling motor. I am much better off with the trolling motor on my left side rather than the right side. But again, people argue about this. I'm not really sure why, but you know, again, you do what makes sense for you. I'm responding to questions about what I do for me and what works for me. So hopefully you guys found these little tips helpful, and I'll talk to you on the next one.